Hong Kong, a compacted city with only 7 square kilometers of actively farmed land, cannot maintain the food supply for the citizens. Therefore, 90% of the total food supply in Hong Kong is imported food. The food comes from all over the world. In any supermarket near your apartment, you can easily buy the frozen beef from Brazil, salmon from Norway, fresh fruit from the United States and rice from Thailand. During the food importation, a great amount of carbon emissions will be directly or indirectly produced in the processes of production, packing, storage and transportation. Because the packing approaches and storage conditions varies a lot, it is difficult to estimate the carbon emissions of packing and storage processes. Therefore, in this case study, we assume that the sum of production and transportation's carbon emissions is approximately equal to the total carbon emission of food importation. As to production, the carbon emission is equals to the volume of imports times the emission intensity, which can be found in the FAO's database. We found that, during the production process, the carbon emission intensity of the meat and offal of the bovine animals and sheep is the greatest, nearly 100 times more than poultry and 30 times more than the meat of swine. So, we recommend that the public should consume more poultry and pork rather than the beef or mutton. As to the transportation process, here comes the equation. Volume of imports times the distance equals to the food miles. Generally speaking, this distance is the distances between farm to fork. However, the distance before exportation and the distance after importation is uncertain, so, the distance here is the distances between port to port. Then, the food miles times the emission coefficient equals to the carbon emission of transportation. 3 major transportations for importing food are the trucks, airplanes, and container ships. In order to simplify the calculation, we assume that the food imported from overseas is all by sea transport. 80% of food that imported from the mainland is by trucks, 15% is by sea transport and 5% is by river transport. Consequently, we got the total carbon emission data of Hong Kong's food importation. Take the beef as an example. Hong Kong import a lot of beef from Brazil every year. However, the emission intensity of the beef from Brazil is relatively strong, while those of the United States is lower. So, in order to reduce the carbon emission, we should increase the market share of those low emission intensity food, and decrease the market share of those high emission intensity food. As Hong Kong Climate Action Plan 2030 indicates, by 2020, Hong Kong should achieve 20% carbon emission reduction compared to 2005, roughly 1.3% reduction per year. So, we assume that, by 2020, in the aspect of food importation, the Hong Kong government should also take some actions to achieve 5.3% carbon emission reduction.